welcome to the Inspired Evolution. And it is such a treat to be here today. I actually cannot confess how excited I am to have this particular speaker here today. For those that don't know, it's Stephen Jenkinson. He's an author, a speaker, and he's the founder of Orphan Wisdom. And somehow, some way, he's a cultural activist. And, you know, it's painstakingly obvious when you hear him talk, but when you think about the work that he's doing and the stuff that he's talking about, a cultural activist is, you know, it's interesting that we need activism in the space of, you know, what we're going to dive into today. So welcome, Stephen. How are you?
Thank you, sir. I'm very good and very pleased to be asked to join you.
It's an absolute treat to have you here. I'd love to dive into a bit of just maybe a little bit of context going into, you've worked a lot with in your past with people that are basically transitioning over, people that are dying. And how did that come to be?
How did I end up in that business, you mean?
Yeah, well, you call it the death trade, which is a whole new coined term, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't know anyone else who calls it that, but I'm fond of it, and it's a perfectly apt and judicious rendering of the actual enterprise. That's for sure. Well, you know, anyone who speaks with authority about one's own life has been reading the wrong mail or something, because you should take a knee before your own life. It's a truth we're known, and admit to a kind of amateur status regarding how things came to be as they are. And, you know, so with that in mind, I can give you some of the biographical details that the allegations of how it came to pass. It's really very simple. I didn't know there was such a thing as a death trade. I obviously knew in the level that everyone knows that people die and they die in other people's care, and then those people die too, and round it goes. But I wasn't really alert to the fact that there was an entire enterprise that was devoted entirely to, as it turned out, seeing to it that people didn't really have to die if they weren't so inclined. And I was approached by a woman who knew me well at the time, and she was persuaded of my aptness for such an undertaking. I was under-persuaded in the extreme because she wanted me to join the hospital staff, and I knew this much about myself then and now, that I'm not really a corporate guy. I just don't play well in the sandbox, you know, and you might as well know this about yourself. There's no sense being foolish in your 60s as to what your inclinations are. And I'm not a consensus building kind of lowest common denominator. As long as we all feel good, it must be good kind of guy. So I didn't think that I would fit well. And I let her know that. And I fought for about a year. I fought off her advances. And finally, I simply acceded to a very simple overture. She said, here's the thing. The hospital staff, most of whom were women at the time and probably still are, have a number of guys on their hands that they're deeply unnerved by. And I said, well, what's unnerving about them? Well, she said they've all had someone die on them recently, or someone's dying now. And they seem to divide up into two camps, and one of them is belligerent, hostile, aggressive, and things of this kind. Yep. I said, yes. What about the other ones? Oh, she said, they're much worse. And so I was a little taken aback, but she also had my attention. And I said, worse how? And she said, oh, they don't say anything at all. Mm-hmm. So it's a matter of course, waiting for something untoward to take place. So it's on the base of that little nuance that I decided I would take the little job, which was to do a 6-week group for these guys. And I didn't have any idea what I was going to do, but I phoned them up. And by the third guy, it became obvious that not one of these guys wanted to be in a group that was only for men, mm-hmm. which in and of itself was something to take note of. But me, you know, being a relatively quick study then, and perhaps now, I cottoned onto this, and I said to the third guy, oh, this is going to work out great for you, man. This is your group. And he said, but I just told you. I said, no, I understand. But what you'll have in common with all the other guys is that none of you want to be in a group for men. And that's the group it's going to be. A men's group for men who don't want to be in a group for men. And somehow I got 7 or 8 takers off the list that they gave me. And we all showed up on the first night, and none of us knew what to do. And by the third week, though, it became painfully apparent what the entire enterprise should be devoted to. And it was the fact that my realization that they were extraordinarily capable where anger is concerned. Now, you and I both know that anger in men is deeply discredited now in the West, across the West, as something like it's the opposite of being a human being, apparently now. And it has no room in any kind of cultural life, etc., and so on. Well, first of all, anger is a naturally occurring event, and there's many a time when it's utterly not only understandable, but mandatory. As long as it's not the only show in town, there's no question that it's part of a healthy emotional repertoire. But discredited as it's been, these guys came into their dying time or the dying time of a loved one with this sort of wicked combination of a heavy reliance upon anger and a deep shame over the fact that they had a lot of anger about these dyings that were going on. And I realized at some point that they were so good at anger, basically to cover for something that they had very little practice at, and that was the art and the skillfulness of being sad. And this had escaped them entirely by the time I had met them, and no longer presented itself as something that was either worthy of their attention or something that should be sought after and practiced by them. And you understand why. And I believe I did, soon into the project, and it came to this, that anger is very enabling. That's the remarkable thing about it. It's a kind of high octane enabler. Yep. Sadness, on the other hand, by comparison, seems to lay you wide open and diminish your capacity to respond. And this is why I said one of these things minus the other is like a one-winged bird. When you're in the trenches, in the emotional and spiritual trenches. So I realized that I had to find some way to give them a way into sadness, because the circumstances in and of themselves did not guarantee that at all. And they dubbed it sad school. That's what they ended up calling the meetings. And it went from something like 6 weeks to something like 18 months at their insistence, with a kind of revolving door of attendees. And somewhere in there, I was claimed, I guess you would say. And there was something about the nature of dying in the West, in my corner of the West at least, and the utter refusal to die when you are, and so on, that made such a desperate claim upon my attention and my sense of what my purpose was, that by the time I agreed to take the gig, my very first dying person was a doctor, as it turned out. And I remember going in, sitting there in his room, and having a complete reassurance that I knew what I was doing. It's not to say that I could have told you all of this at the time, but looking back on it now, I know that I was in the saddle that was reserved for me. And I had a deep understanding of what I was called upon to do. And that's how it began. In other words, I discovered at least one of the things I was born for. And, kicking and screaming, I found it.
That's fascinating. The thing that's really coming up for me as you've shared that, thank you so much for sharing that, is the idea that, you're sitting in the saddle that you were, that was designed for you. Basically, you are being who you were born to be. That's fascinating because it's, many times, like, we kind of think we have this innate understanding of what our purpose is, and we're meant to know it from the outset, and we just sort of live that life. We're talking a lot about living in this question, but I've also heard in one of my favorite talks of yours, it went along the lines of basically how we live our life is actually how we die. So if you live small, you die small. I think I'm directly quoting you. And so, in terms of finding your purpose, but also realizing that, it was like you said, you were perhaps 60 when you realized that, this was your work. This was the saddle that, you were meant to be for. So can we talk a little bit about living in the life that, fits, because a lot of people struggle with things like imposter syndrome in terms of what they're meant to be doing and all this sort of stuff.
Sorry, the last part, the connection died out a little bit. What was the last part?
The last part was basically a lot of people often struggle with what they're doing and how they feel like, imposter syndrome for that. I know that, you've reflected that, this has been your calling in terms of this has been the work that you were really meant to be doing. But it also came at quite a later stage through, having gone through so much of life to realize that, your offering is basically, or your work is to support people with, the taboos around death and dying.
Well, I think the meaning of your life is a kind of latter half discovery. I mean, the first half of your life, it seems to be the case that you're bumbling around, finding all kinds of other people's reasons to be alive and other, assignments and coming to other people's senses, you could say. And somewhere in the proceedings, if you're lucky and if you endure long enough, and if you're not driven to absolute distraction by the absence of a clear and concise take on what you're doing here, well, maybe you run out of, all the other possibilities are stripped from you, and the only thing that's left standing is you. I mean, that could well be. I don't mean to make this sound like any kind of a victory march or a heroic journey by any stretch. But the fact that it came to me in my, I'm going to guess, early to mid 40s, is, among other things, a sign that apparently there was a certain degree of readiness that was required of me, which I was neither born with nor came out of school with. And that readiness basically earned me a bedside seat at the 3-ring circus of dying in the West. You see, and I would say it deliberately that way, that I had to earn my right to be in on other people's demise. Because this is not a spectator sport after all. Neither is it a kind of generic supporting role that you are charged with. Because the entire enterprise is determined by the realities of the time and place in which the people are dying, in which you are employed to be of some benefit to them. And somewhere in there, I realized that these dying people were never going to ask of me what I owed to them. What I owed to them was the opportunity to die. I subsequently called the book Die Wise. So that's the word I would use. That they had an obligation not to die well, not to die peacefully, not even to die with dignity. Let's raise the notion that death and wisdom in some radical way belong together. And that was the marriage I was trying to effect. And there was nobody that was seeking that out, you see. People came to their dying time in no appreciable disturbance from the way they had approached every other minor blip on the horizon of their plans. And it was absolutely staggering. The only comparison I can think to make, and I make it as an outsider, as you'll see, is I think about a woman recently told that she's pregnant. And what she does in the following, 7.5 or 8 months is to live a life so undisturbed by this news that she is every North American poster child for, personal freedom, and that she has no obligation to suddenly change her life fundamentally in terms of eating, drinking, smoking, the obvious ones, and more subtly, sleep and rest and a sense of well-being. You understand what I'm saying? Yes. If you take the notion that people are inherently free, and as this to subvert the old phrase, and everywhere live in chains, and then you challenge this by wondering whether or not our freedom, quote unquote, isn't actually there to serve what comes to us in life, rather than to excuse us from what comes to us in life. If you think that thought, and then you come to the understanding of dying as something that we owe to life, not something that has come to betray or otherwise undo us, then the repertoire is entirely different from the one that you would employ to defend yourself or to maintain a kind of steady as she goes lunacy. So this is what I was engaged in constantly. And as I did so, it became more and more clear to me that I wasn't in any way a psychodynamic practitioner or a psychological consultant or an inner work or inner child magician. What I was a culture worker. Right. That's what hit me, that my principal obligation was my principal, let's say, range of motion, at least kind of psychically, intellectually, and even spiritually. My range of motion is in the direction of the kind of moral order which the cultural life asks of us, recommends to us, provides to us, and ultimately tries to employ in us.
Yeah, it's fascinating because obviously I've been even just using the term I've been attracted to your work with Die Wise, is I can feel like how that sounds so weird and those that are attracted to death. But I had some recent loss. I had some really amazing support around me to sort of tell me about amazing people whose work could support me on the journey of resolving some of the grief and the anger. So that's been really profound. But even as we're sharing just little parts through your story now, I'm noticing that, you mentioned that, it was at about the age of 40 that you had what you needed in order to facilitate the work that you needed to do. And then obviously we're talking about death and getting to that stage. Because you're coming down for a talk all through up and down the east coast of Australia, actually, and you're doing Melbourne, Sydney, and it's pretty much this week, and then you're off to New Zealand, and then Queensland, and back down from Queensland again. So we've got you for a couple of weeks in Australia, which we're really excited about. But the talk's called Coming of Age, which is your new book. So, I think in and around there is a nice little introduction to talk about, because coming of age, also a lot of work that you do is based on, recently I've been reading the messaging, which is about elderhood, and, the lack of elders that we have. What is that? Can you, for those that are listening in for the first time, why is there a lack of elders, and what does that really mean?
Okay, see if I can narrow this down into something we can actually listen to in 5 or 7 minute answer. It took me 400 pages to answer that question, but no problem. It's a good challenge to have. Well, first of all, in fairness to you, you slightly misquoted the title of the book and the endeavors that ensue from it. I actually called the book "Come of Age." Not coming of age.
Thank you.
And it's a fundamental difference. It's not just a matter of a couple of letters. And here's why. It's just the same reason I didn't call the book Dying Wise. Or I didn't call it Die Wisely. Yeah. Because in both of these titles, what you have is, particularly in the second one, in the Come of Age book, the title is obviously what's called in the trade hortatory. It's not a commonly used word anymore, but it's the same root as the verb to exhort or exhortation. It's the notion of the hortatory trade is a combination, you could say, of a little bit of teaching, a little bit of preaching, quite a bit of pleading, making the case for, and otherwise imploring. That's all in the notion of exhortation. So certainly that's there. In other words, if you were unkindly disposed towards me, you would say, I'm bossing people around and telling them what to do, which is not inaccurate. It's, to a certain degree, that's true. But there's another thrust to the sound of Come of Age that in days gone by, and I remember some of these days now, that we would use the phrase come of age as an adjectival phrase that signaled a recognition that had deep approval in it, deep regard, a considerable degree of respect, and all of it signaled what? That whether it was a person or a particular bottle of wine or a book's ideas or a work of art, that all of these things, when they first came among us, had such a degree of novelty that they were basically, they escaped our attention in some fashion. And it was a combination of their enduring presence and our continued exposure to them that turned them into something in our lives that had more presence and less allegation in it. And we would have used the expression in the old days, we would say of that person or of that wine or that idea that it has come of age, which is to say it has gained entry and it's earned its place, if you will. And nothing further is required of it other than to be itself. So that's not a bad overture to the answer that I would have to give you. Let's start with the question, what the hell happened? That prompted me to take a couple years out of my life and see if I could address myself to this thing. Well, I'm sure you've heard the phrase, you may have used it a time or two, it may have been used upon you a time or two, and certainly the people listening to us would recognize it. And it goes like this, respect your elders. Mm-hmm. Now, the way it's said today, this is a prescription, okay? It's a prescription for right behavior on the part of somewhat younger people, basically. And the interesting thing about observing this from a cultural point of view is it was not always a prescription. There was a time when the phrase respect your elders was a description, not a prescription. In other words, it was describing observable and chronic behaviors in the general population, right? So when you're saying respect your elders, you were acknowledging the weather, this sort of an aspect of the cultural weather, which is to say that one respected one's elders. Now let's ask the troubling question, why? Well, one answer is it's not a bad thing to practice at least preemptive respect. That's not a bad way to go through life. It doesn't disable you when it comes to understanding, the various comings and goings of what you're trying to respect. But to begin with, respect is not a bad thing at all. But I'm suggesting here that the old weather of respecting your elders was a two-part formula, and only one part appears in the exhortation. The part that never appears and that nobody talks about, at least not in my hearing, is you respect your elders in part because they have carried themselves in a respectable way. That's the second part. Okay, you respect your elders because they're respectable, you see. And of course, the reason I'm pointing this out to you is the reason it's become a prescription today is because the second half is not a given. It is not a given that older people, by definition of being older people, have conducted themselves in their lives, in the time that they were born to, in the corner of the world that they were born to, in a way that more or less inevitably generates the instinct for respect amongst the people younger than them in whose midst they live. And this is a rather full-mouthed way of saying the following. Something has happened of such seismic consequence. I'm not sure how old it is, but at the very least, it's very clear now, and not just to younger people, that older people, when they were middle-aged people or younger people, had the opportunity to live a kind of life that would signal to the people not yet born that they had conducted themselves as if the not yet born people would eventually be born, would eventually be children, and would eventually inherit the world that these early and middle age and finally older people would hand off to them when the time came. There would be a sign of a willingness to live as if the unborn were certainly going to come among them. So what I can point your attention to, sadly, goes like this. When many, many older people come to the teachings I do about this subject, and sadly, but markedly, what they do is they expect me to recognize and reward and imbue their lives with a kind of automatic stamp of approval, wherein their inalienable elderhood is recognized, conferred upon them, and they're thanked for their, countless decades of active duty, etc., and so on. Excuse me a second. So, here's what I'm here to tell you, and this will not go down well for at least some people listening, probably. Mm-hmm. But it goes like this. In the days when the people who are asking me to recognize them as elders, today, next week, when I come to your country, I have no reason to believe it won't be there in some fashion. When it was their turn to occupy those positions of relative responsibility, influence, and consequence in their workplaces, mm-hmm. when they were beginning to approach their peak income generating years, when they had positions that had, and let's be fair and acknowledge that a lot of people's jobs are not of the kind of global influence scale. At least not overtly, they're not. Mm. But subtly, it's not inconceivable to see your work as a kind of subtle consequence generating event, and to take some responsibility for conducting yourself in such a way that subtle consequences will emanate from the things you do and from the things you don't do, the things you refuse to do, the things that you don't have the stomach for, etc., and so on. Mm-hmm. So you have these people in their early and middle age and so on, and they're in this period in their lives, and you ask a simple question of them at that time, and it's this: how did you conduct yourself given how the world was? Not given what your family wanted from you, not your personal goals and so on, but given the state of the world. How did you conduct yourself? And can we tell that you were governed in some fashion by a kind of almost involuntary awareness that caused a lot of heartache, that we were entering into a time of, considerable turbulence and unmistakable downward momentum? The answer is very clear, because the downward momentum is in part a consequence of their unwillingness to live as such. Mm. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So don't get me wrong, I'm not laying all of the blame of every integer of ecological disaster on the sort of middle class of your country or mine or the United States or Western Europe and so on, saying it all comes down to their buying habits. Mm-hmm. Although you could make some case that it's certainly in there.
Has supported, yeah, for sure.
Right? Okay. So what's happening now is younger people are being asked to inherit a world and to inherit a youth, a young time in their lives that literally bears no resemblance to the world as it was when I was young.
Sure.
Utterly no resemblance at all. Mm-hmm. And that has changed in the course of my lifetime. Mm-hmm. Which is to say, older people bear some responsibility for that massive eclipse of the sense of possibility, the sense of personal agency, and these things are in desperate eclipse. I asked my son the other day when I sat with breakfast, he's 31 or 2, and I said to him, when you look into the future, what do you think about? How does it look to you? How does it sit with you, this kind of thing? Hmm. And you know what he said to me? He said, I don't think about it very much. And that answer is palpably not true. It's a kind of coping strategy. You don't think about something because you've already decided doing so doesn't pay. And the way you decided that is because when you used to think about it, it was very difficult to continue. So it's a kind of adaptive strategy that, it speaks for itself, it seems. So all of this then is to say, somewhere in the mix, the willingness of people to live as if they will be old people one day, as if they will be obliged to occupy the position and the office of elderhood, and as if they would be in some way, I'm going to use the word answerable to younger people. This is a little different from accountable, but I'm saying this, it comes to this, that we all might live our lives. I know you're thinking, God almighty, this is a long answer, man. But, it was a big question.
Yeah.
But here's the last part of it for now, that it seems to be the obligation of all of us to proceed as if the day will come, perhaps in the not too distant future, when someone 1/2 or 1/3 your age will come to you and they'll have 2 questions for you. And they're very simple questions, which are not easy to answer. And the first one, in some version or other, will go like this. When you were my age, did you know what was happening? Okay? There's not a lot of elaboration necessary because it's quite palpable where that question's coming from. And the answer, the only authentic answer, not the pleasing one, not the comforting one, but the authentic one, has to include the following. When I was your age, technology and information being what it was, anyone who wanted to know what was going on could have known. This is beyond any reasonable doubt.
Yep.
But the truth of the matter is, not everybody did want to know. And so not everybody did. And for what I can tell, things may not have changed so enormously since those days. The second question that follows from that is, so what did you do? And these 2 questions basically are the proscenium arch under which your elderhood function will unfold or will shrivel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. It's very profound. What's coming up for me in this juncture of the conversation is the part that ignorance plays in our human condition, and how much we lean in on that and how much we lean away from that. It's it seems to be embedded as part of out of sight, out of mind. But you've also flagged that it's that is what's coming up for me is that it is pure ignorance that we're leaning in on in terms of knowing that we are one day going to be able to. And in and around that, like being ignorant and putting things out of sight, out of mind, I also look at the trend of, there is even the ability to the people that we could ask these questions of collectively as people. We tend to put these people in nursing homes, put them in care, that we, there is wisdom there potentially for people that may be able to answer these 2 questions well. But we seem to ostracize them from our day-to-day life and living, so that the younger generation can't connect to them and realize that this is a question that is worth having. We don't have the opportunity to ask that question because we've removed a lot of the people from our immediate environment. We live in this kind of mildly pleasant ignorance, disassociated from even just growing up, even just to come of age and be old. So yeah, this dance around ignorance, do you think that is just part of the human condition, despite it necessarily obviously being something we need to address?
Well, I'm not a good generalist, so I'm very loath to make observations across all of humankind, across human history, across cultural difference and linguistic difference and so on. I've a couple of times mentioned to you in passing, in my corner of the world, that kind of qualification is, I would use that again and say, well, it's very clear that not every culture in the world offloads its old people. Obviously not. I mean, there are a number of places where this is not true, but you begin to notice everywhere where the information technology, it makes its inroads, also has this kind of dismissive orientation to what preceded it. In other words, there's something about the technology that that enforces a kind of wicked etiquette vis-a-vis everything that preceded you. It makes it appear something in the order of irrelevant at best, or obsolete, or past its day. And this can be a person, of course. This can be an idea. This can be a range of human experiences. And as soon as you come into a time, which you have certainly come into, where the only, quote, truth is a personal truth, as soon as this is true, then apparently all of these truths are age-specific things, you see. And if they're age-specific things, what use could there be to an old life? You see, I'm inhabiting a middle-aged or a younger person's body long enough to wonder that out loud, you see?
Yep.
So how about this? When I used to work in the death trade, we were routinely asked by people how much longer they had to live, or their loved one would ask, how much longer does my father have to live, and so on. And unfortunately, the doctors would basically misrepresent things and say, it's not really knowable, which was categorically not the case. We routinely knew how much longer they had to within a week or even a few days. Not because we were brilliant, but because we had a certain sort of hip pocket calculus that we used to figure it out. And I think you're going to see why this pertains to what we're talking about momentarily. What we would say was, we observed the changes, the symptomatic changes and so on, the progress of the disease and so on. But the other thing we observed is the rate at which those changes changed. And that's a different order of observation, you see. Okay, so if you use this and apply it at the level of culture, not at the level of individual cancer development, but at the level of culture, you begin to see something that's profoundly unwelcome, I think. And it goes like this. We're buffeted at two layers now. One of them is simply the changes that are surrounding us in the technology that's around and is informing our days. But we're also deeply unnerved by the rate at which that change is taking place, because the change is accelerating. And in that sense, it feels a bit like a runaway train. And if you stop and think about this artificial intelligence stuff for 5 minutes, you can run out of the room screaming. And you can think to yourself, Orwell and his ilk had it right a long time ago, right? Okay, so you take this and then you make a simple observation at the cultural level. Here it goes. We are in a time of increasing rapidity of change. At the same time that we're having increased diagnosis in neurological disorders that affect, among other things, older people's capacity to remember. Neurodegenerative disease is on the increase. At exactly the same time, when individual human memory is becoming more and more obsolete because it's being replaced by pocket gizmos and by Google and by Wikipedia and so forth. Nick Cave, bless his bones, he's got a wonderful line from one of his songs. He says, Wikipedia is heaven if you don't want to remember no more. It's just such an astute observation, you see?
Absolutely.
So I'm suggesting to you that the rate of change that we're surrounded by in the culture generally is having its consequence individually in terms of a breakdown of the neurological capacities. And it's not just affecting old people, it's affecting young people in a similarly devastating way. I don't know if this is true where you live, but certainly here we have an increased diagnosis of attention deficit disorders amongst young people, particularly in the school system, right? Okay, this is happening at exactly the same time that the rate of change is accelerating so rapidly that it frankly beggars, I would even say dares you to find a way to care about what's happening. It really fundamentally undermines the merit of investing yourself deeply in the current order long enough to figure out how it got this way, never mind what you might do about it rehabilitatively, you see. So in other words, I'm suggesting that the very young and the very old are kind of have become now canaries in the coal mine, to use that old phrase.
Absolutely.
And they're kind of our sentinel species. And they're actually, their afflictions are signs.
Yeah, profound. As you were sharing that, there was this distinct realization I've been harboring for a little while, which is, I'm son of an immigrant family that came to Australia from India, and in my culture, in India, You elders, even the way we lived at home was very different. You lived in your grandfather's house. Children didn't live in their mother's and father's house and leave when they were between the ages of 18 and 25, because of the relaxation of Western society. You would live in your grandfather's house, and then all the children, and then their grandchildren. So all the grandchildren would be living under the same roof. So there's 3 tiers of generation. And I noticed when my father migrated, he spent a lot of his time on the phone to his parents in his downtime. And some part of me looks in from my lens, which is, growing up with the sound of the internet all around, and realizing that he didn't have the internet to answer his question. He didn't have technology to support his way through life the way that I did. He had different technology. But when it came down to simple things like, what should I do with, let's just come up with a really lame example, but like, okay, I've got a silk shirt. How do I wash that? This is a very simple example.
Mm-hmm.
Or his mother, right? So he would contact his mother. There would be a relationship there. Whereas now, I've learned how to use a washing machine. I've learned how to repair a washing machine through basically the internet. I've never asked my father how I need to wash or treat a particular garment. Now, it seems mundane, seems like a foolish example, but the reality is,
not to me, it doesn't.
Yeah, I distinctly remember how important my grandmother felt in my father's life, and how connected she was to him and what he was doing every day and what was going on for me. And she remembered all that. And this is what we're talking about with memory and the internet. And I think it's really profound the way you've articulated these are the canaries in the coal mine. The fact that we have so much attention to disorder, and the fact that amnesia is like this thing, which is, we're consistently handing off parts of our cognitive burden or perceived burden onto technology to support us in this day in society to the best of our ability, but it is coming at a cost of, our neural capacities and our well-being mentally that way.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and I can tell you used the word burden, and it reminded me of when I was working in the death trade. The fear of becoming a burden was the principal reason or fear, I should say, that prompted dying people to ask us to euthanize them. How about that? I mean, that's about as in the trenches as you can get. Mm-hmm. Of all the reasons to want to hasten your death, the prospect of having your family obliged to care for you was the principal thing that drove you to kill yourself before you could die. I mean, that's real. I lived that every week when I was in the death trade. And what I'd suggest, and in fact, I'm taking my cue from your example here, is that burden is one of the ways by which we know we're there. If we are, quote unquote, burdened by the needs or even the presence of another person, it's one of the signs of our existence. It's one of the signs not only that we're present, but at some level, apparently, we're at least temporarily mandatory. And you could go one step further from burden and imagine it something like this. This is a true story, and it really happened too. I had a guy doing an interview with me like this, and he said, now, I don't know if you've heard this, and it's going to sound like science fiction to you. And of course, it's probably too late for you, he said. But they're working on a serum, he said. And when they finalize the fine tuning of the serum, and you take it, you won't have to die. That was his characterization. You won't have to die. And there was a long pause after he set the question up. And then he said, so my question to you is, if I take the serum and I don't die, what will I miss? Which was an enormously achieved question, because the degree of imaginative reconstruction of what it means to die was breathtaking and beautiful, and really asked of me something quite remarkable in response. And I said to him, well, I said, with all due respect, I think the question has the emphasis on the wrong syllable. I think really the question would be this: if you take the serum, it's not that you won't have to die, it's that you won't be able to. You see, In other words, reimagine your dying as a capacity, not an affliction. And if you do that, then you realize your dying is something that asks things of you rather than doing something to you. And it's occupies a fundamental place in the moral order of human life. But for all of that, the question might be, if you take the serum and you're not able to die, what then will the rest of us miss? Not you, the rest of us. Because, of course, we all learn about these things from every death that precedes our own. Do we not? Of course we do. Mm-hmm. How else to learn it? I mean, you can read Die Wise till the cows come home, but if you're not in on the slow-moving death of a fellow human half a dozen times before yours comes around, the chances are you come to your death as an amateur.
Yeah.
So I remembered that interview, and years went by. Last year or the year before, I'm listening to an interview with this fellow who wrote The Brief History of Humanity, or I can't remember exact title, but it was a blockbuster all over the English-speaking world and so on. And he had a new book about the near future. This was what the interview was about. And he said, the interviewer asks him, so what do you think's coming next? Or what's coming? And he said, well, they're working on a serum, and it's going to sound like science fiction to you. And I thought to myself, man, I've heard this before. And he said, and judging by your voice, he said, it's probably too late for you. But still, they're working on a serum. And when you take the serum, you won't have to die. Exactly the same characterization. And this is as a million-seller author, right? With exactly the same spell on his tongue as the other fellow. So then there was a pause. And the interviewer said, so what will that mean if we don't die? And the author said, well, it means that we'll be divine. That's the word that he used. And it really caught my attention. And I began to think about it, and it occurred to me, of course, because in this rendering, his understanding of divinity includes immortality, as most people's understanding of divinity would. But if you pursue the tail of that particular snake, you come to this realization. Rather than wonder whether or not we're indeed going to be divine if we take this serum, rather ask yourself, what is it that makes us human? Mm. And one of the answers that comes directly out of this little example is, what makes us human is the capacity for endings. Not the capacity to defy them, but the capacity to obey them. Endings, frailties, limits. That's where our humanity has always appeared. See? And it's miraculously, you could say in a kind of alchemical way, it can be when we're at our quote unquote best. You know, one more idea about this and I'll turn it over to you. We have a word human in the English language. Everybody would say very quickly, you know, human, and people would say, yeah, I know. So here's the question. We have the word human, and then we put an E on the end of the word. We have a different word.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the difference between these two things besides the E? And I suggest to you it's this. Human is the word that we have gathered about ourselves, particularly in the Enlightenment West, to characterize a kind of sequence of inalienable characteristics which we cannot lose track of. They cannot be rescinded or withdrawn. No one can take them away from us. Our humanness is our prized possession, or at least that's the allegation. Why then do we have a adjective humane if being human is inevitable? And the answer is, there's a closet or a covert realization that being human is not an inevitable consequence of having been born with the capacity to be human. And it seems to be in the order of things that humans are capable of the most extraordinary inhumanity imaginable. And history, of course, bears this out. So we have this word humane as a kind of out clause, wherein it acknowledges the fact that us being human is not really an inalienable bundle of characteristics that we own, that in fact we dip in and out of it with maddening regularity. And this brings us back to the question of elderhood long enough to ask this. Where does our understanding of elderhood comes from? Today, it seems to come from our understanding of geriatrics, of all things. Well, here's the problem, though. If elderhood was synonymous with agedness, then at least in my country and the United States, and I'm guessing your country too, all of us would be awash in the inevitable majesty and sagacity that comes with elderhood. Why? Because there's so many geezers around. That's why.
There's a burgeoning population of,
Right? Okay. That's what it should mean. And it should mean that the older the population is, the more sustainable and sustaining the life that ensues from their presence should be. Mm-hmm. In which case, we should be the absolute and utter envy of every human generation that preceded us, because our capacity for wisdom is borders on the unbearable. Mm-hmm. And demonstrably, the reverse is true, that we have more older people than we've ever had. And the moderating and guiding presence of elderhood is in such deep disarray as to border on, it's AWOL. It's gone AWOL. It's so scarce that it's become a rumor more than a description of anything.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. There's this piece that you were talking to, basically, which is, you were talking to it, and I really want to acknowledge it, is, you just mentioned that our capacity to end, our capacity to live out, I'm going to use the word fulfillment, is something that your work has really supported me personally with. I often think about, living a life. It's just part of my personal development type of genome DNA kind of forward-thinking mind. And I often try and, for a while there, I was orientating myself towards happiness. And I realized that is not necessarily, the strongest orientation to have, even though it is the most, perhaps, shiny one. Since then, it's been more about fulfillment. And I've been trying to work on fulfillment, and that is, where purpose comes in a lot. And that's where some of the earlier questions in this came from, like, how did you know that this was your path? But in and around fulfillment, I realized that listening to more and more that I listen to you, and this is something I just want to share, is what I've come to realize is that, there is like every tea has an optimal steeping time, and at a certain point, the tea bag must come out of the cup, for the tea to be what it must be, and I've come to realize that that is the process of what I now see as, the next iteration of death and dying, and, removing the tea bag from the cup. And there's a fulfilling, it's almost like prophetic in that, that is now the tea, that is now the story, that is now the life that was. There's an interesting couple of things I'd like to try and weave into one question, if possible, or one sort of discourse from you on following the question, which is, there's this thing that we're doing, which is we're taking more and more medication. I've heard you directly talk to this, to prolong dying, rather than avoiding the fulfillment of what death can be. That's the first part to it. And then the second part is what that death is, what you were talking to, is we're robbing our younger generations the opportunity of seeing, like, death fulfilled, because people aren't embodying the grace or the wisdom, really, the wisdom to die knowing that they're dying, and knowing that that is the seal on the life that then permeates into the awareness of the next generation and forms their process of the same thing.
Leonard Cohen, I should just stop after his name, because so many things ensue from him and his work. He's got a gorgeous line apropos of this. He says, "Behold the gates of mercy in ordinary space, and none of us deserving the cruelty or the grace." Okay? So it's a beautiful way of coming down from the victory march, the superhighway of personal fulfillment, and reacquainting ourselves with the notion that our personal fulfillment is a consequence and not a cause. It's a consequence of other endeavors. particularly, the old adage, and it's a very useful one, that how rich can you be if there are poor people in your midst? I mean, your capacity to be rich in every meaningful sense of the term is predicated on the most vulnerable aspects of your population and how they're doing, and how you are with them, and so on. So, of course, if you extend the lifespan, and there's no if, that's exactly what's happening, and you mess with people's capacity to die on schedule, and then you forbid the understanding that there's such a thing as your turn to die, your time to die. All of this becomes negotiable. And then you mistake this as for an act of love, where you oblige the dying person to hang on and try one more round of chemotherapy and all the rest, because they owe it to the people around them who are not ready for them to die yet. Without anybody looking up from this ridiculous passion play and saying, well, look, get ready because it's coming, kind of thing. And understand that as the moral imperative, not the moral imperative simply because we have the technology to mess with the lifespan doesn't confer upon that a moral necessity. And yet I saw this over and over again in the death trade. If we can, we should, becomes the 11th commandment of the enterprise. If we can, we should. Well, we're in a position now where there's no if. We can, and we are. And the consequences have a direct bearing upon the status of old people in our midst. How's that for a connection? And it goes like this. When you mess with frailties of all kinds, and you banish not only the ultimate frailty, dying, and you prolong it insufferably, one of the direct consequences of this is that there's no longer any merit to enduring. There's no merit to learning the ins and outs of frailty, of properly submitting yourself to them. And this all becomes like a sucker's game. And then it's no surprise that those people most ruled by physical limitation are the people who are most left out of the social calculation of worth and merit. You see why? Because the limits that have now been, officially sneered at by the powers that be are only making a firm claim upon the very young and the very old. And everybody else gets a pass as they work on ever more improving, drugs in Switzerland and elsewhere to free us from the obligation to be bound by these things. And what does your body become when you are sustained in this notion that you have no obligation to ebb? And the answer is your body becomes an encumbrance, not a treasure, not something loaned to you and entrusted to you for a short period of time that you might properly understand that it's a little bit of the world that's entrusted to you to take care of. Right? That's what your body is. And its limits are the exact same kinds of limits that are around us ecologically. And those limits are not there to bedevil us. They're there to implore us to engage our humanity most deeply. The limits of the world around us is another chance for us to get it right where being a human is concerned. And if you keep pushing the limits back, then you make every limit an exercise in vague tolerance at best. And intolerance becomes the repertoire. The unwillingness to go along with limits and endings that are inconvenient to you. And this serves more and more the self-aggrandizing, self-improvement, self-regulating, self-madeness that has made America both the envy and the ridicule of the world at the same moment. See, so this is a lot to say in one sentence or two, and I know we're at the end of our time here. And, one of the things it suggests is, well, we probably needed at least another hour.
We'll follow it up for sure. There's, I think as you're sharing this, one of the biggest takeaways, and I think, just a very humble reminder at the end of the conversation is, my personal takeaway has been that, our conversation through elderhood, and especially the way you're describing death now is, death is something sacred. It is something deeply, deeply sacred. And it's just mirroring the fact that life is something deeply, deeply sacred. And there's just a call to remind us to reflect on that as well. I just want to tie out with, I think you've answered this question quite a few times in quite a few places. Just for the listeners of the Inspired Evolution, just to know that this is, I think this would be really nice for the energy is, your relationship with death. I think many people would think that, from the outset that, having spent so much time with people that are transitioning and spent so much time with, talking and conversing and writing books on the matter, you would be quite at home with it. Is that the truth?
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. Yes, routinely I've been asked, the math goes simply like this. So you've seen a lot of death? Yes, I have. And somewhere in there, you must have seen your own death a time or two. Yes, I have. And so you must be good with it then. As if chronic exposure to something invariably makes you more able where it's concerned.
Yeah.
If that's true, we should be geniuses at global warming any time now. Okay, so my answer is that I give with no cynicism, at all, no sneering at all, is this. There was something in my formal encounter with my own demise that did two things to me at the same time. It absolutely broke my heart, and it's never mended, and it never will mend, and it will never be as it once was. And along with that brokenheartedness came an enormous love of being alive. And those two things I understand to be unidentical twins. And where you find one, you're very likely to find the other engaged, you see? So I say to these people, well, I found life to be habit forming, actually. And I have no, quote, intention of accepting my death. Why should I? It's not that I don't know it. It's not that I don't respect it. I have an enormous respect for it, but I have no interest in prompting it. And I would rather be informed by its influence than run screaming for the hills towards an alleged life-affirming orientation. So for me, it comes to this, and this is going to sound like it comes from mythic territory, and probably it does. Mm-hmm. My imagination tells me this, that there's such a thing as gods, in the plural with capital G on every one of them. Mm-hmm. And let's imagine that the frailties and the limits that I was talking about earlier are in the realm of being human. And let's imagine that the gods themselves don't seem to participate in these limits in the way that we do. They don't seem to be afflicted by them or to be the bearers of them. This seems to be uniquely a human thing. And this is the way it occurs to me to say is that what the gods did when they participated in conjuring us is they entrusted us with limits, something that they did not entrust to themselves. To me, that's an extraordinary reversal of understanding a limit as something that cramps your style. Mm-hmm. What limit really is the opportunity for your style finally to appear. Mm-hmm. See? So I find that enormously restoring. Mm-hmm. That and if it's not true, well, it should be true. And so I'm going with it as a kind of personal theology, that the gods have entrusted limits to humans, perhaps because they, as gods, couldn't quite carry them. A little too burdensome for gods, but right up a human being's alley.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that will inspire my evolution. So for those tuning in, I just want to remind you guys there's an amazing opportunity to have this conversation further. As you know, Stephen is pretty much an open book. He has written books, very easy to communicate with, and he's doing author readings. Come of age. He's coming up and down Melbourne, Sydney. He's off to New Zealand, and that is basically, I think the dates are from 26th of April, he's in Australia, all the way through to early mid-May. So he's going across the pond to New Zealand for a little bit, and then he'll be back across to Queensland and then working his way down from Queensland back towards New South Wales before he heads off to the UK and says goodbye to us. But as you can see, there's a lot to be talked about here, and I'm looking forward to having another conversation in the future in a deeper podcast. But, I feel like we could probably talk about this forever and ever and ever. So I'm really excited to, when you are coming down, to having this conversation again and learning a lot more about this. And while I'm on that note, I just want to thank you, obviously, for coming to Australia, but also thank you, for a lot of the work that goes into, I know that, we can have these glamorous podcast conversations, but, on the back of that, there was a lot of time spent with people that are processing passing, and a lot of that probably wasn't glamorous, Yeah, so I'm really grateful for the work who you are and who you've shown up in life, and just following that path. And then obviously today, and your time and energy, and wishing you all the best for the very forward coming future in Australia. And thank you so much.
Thank you. So, you're very kind to imagine that anything I could come up with would be something that you'd like to align your show with in some way, and that could be possibly useful to somebody who accidentally overhears us while they're doing the laundry.
Hopefully they're reminded to call their parents about which softener to use.
Right. Unless they are the parents, and that would be great too.
Thank you, Stephen. Really appreciate
Thank you, sir.
Energy.
Take care of yourself.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in to the Love of the Inspired Evolution and sharing the Love of the Inspired Evolution. If you feel like this content has supported you, or may support anyone else that may resonate with the content of it, please share away and share the love around. Thank you guys so much. And to stay up to date on whatever's coming out with the Inspired Evolution, please subscribe. There's all these links in the bio for you to tune into the episodes and all these different platforms, just so the message can get to you and your loved ones. Thank you so much for all your love and support. Stay inspired to evolve.